Hello again. So the second cultural dimension we are going to talk about in this video is actually the power distance values. And also, once we go through that a little bit, we're going to reflect back on the first dimension we spoke about, which is high context and low context communication methods, because that also changes according to those values in any given culture. And we will see why or how very shortly. Very simply, power distance values, they are categorized into two categories. So large power distance or small power distance. So large power distance cultures are also the same cultures that use high context communication values. And in those cultures, the members of a large power distance culture give priority treatment and asymmetrical respect to people who are in high status positions. In a small power distance culture, members in either, so members again, it's members of that culture, members in either high status or low status positions strive to foster informal symmetrical interaction. Now, what does that mean? A very simple example is if you have a supervisor and a subordinate in a particular working place. So at work, the boss is the boss and the subordinate is the subordinate, and they have this formal relationship. Now, if it happens that those two very same persons meet outside of the work environment, let's say they're both queuing to buy tickets for the cinema. If the subordinate spots his boss standing in the queue behind him, they would normally ask their boss to come and take their place, or always give preference to the boss. So here we see how this asymmetrical respect or priority treatment manifests, as opposed to a small power distance culture. If you and your boss are queuing up at the cafeteria in the workplace, if you are there before your boss and he's there behind you, you would not normally switch places because it's viewed as normal. Another good example is how this manifests when persons address each other or call each other. Let's take the example of a university. So a university in a large power distance culture, students would always call their teachers as professor or doctor, as opposed to a university setup in a small power distance, they will both be talking to each other on first name basis. So again, this demonstrates in that how in a small power distance culture, they tend to just foster informal symmetrical interaction, as opposed to a large power distance culture where some sort of like priority treatment or asymmetrical respect is the way to do things or to conduct business. How does that reflect in your workplace? In a large power distance culture, subordinates know their humble role, and I'm quoting right here, and the superiors are sort of the ones who know it all. So a superior is expected to play a more authoritative role. They sort of command and expect the subordinates just to do what they're commanded to do without much opportunity to argue or discuss or challenge the decisions by the superiors. Again, it's not black and white. Of course, you have different variations and it differs from one culture to another. But we can think that, for example, Eastern Asian cultures like Japan and China, seniors are way more sort of obeyed, are a lot more obeyed, and it's very difficult to challenge a senior than it is in the United States. Arab countries are still a large power distance culture, but you can have maybe a higher chance to argue with superior at work, as opposed to Eastern Asia. Perhaps I haven't been to Eastern Asia, so I don't know very well about that. But again, within a particular Arab country, that changes. So if you're working in a multinational corporation or an international organization where many of your local employees have attended foreign schools and they've been abroad, they would definitely understand what a small power distance is. But if we're talking about strict public institutes, then you'll mostly find large power distance practices. So again, if you're working in a particular organization and you have to deal with the government sector, or more often tribes, actually, if you're working in an area like Sudan or Yemen where you have to deal with tribal leaders, large power distance values are very heavily enforced in tribal culture. So you have to bear that in mind. The important thing here is how this reflects on communication. So as we said, normally large power distance culture is where high context communication is used. Now the thing here is this can often not be the case. So why is that? Is simply, I mean, in a large power distance, a person in a high status would address their subordinates in a low context sort of communication, because they don't need to be polite. They are the bosses, they can do whatever they please, they can command what and ask what they want whenever they want it. So they just need to say the message verbally. Now, high context communication, as we explained earlier, is a little bit it's some sort of politeness or a gesture of politeness, and that's how I perceive it. I myself, I mean, I was born and raised in Egypt, which is a very, in a way, large power distance culture. I've worked in Yemen, in Iraq, I've been to Saudi quite often, and I've worked in Sudan as well, and Syria, and been around in Lebanon and Jordan, and all of those can be classified as large power distance cultures. And when you deal with tribal leaders, or you see how bosses command their subordinates in a working place, and then the subordinates, wherever they respond, they have to respond in a high context manner, which is indirect, lots of excuses or lots of justifications before they actually get to the point, and they have to choose the right time to say what they want to say. So it can really show. And this should be helpful to any professional, depending on what kind of culture they are. If they are in a large power distance culture and they address a senior person, a tribal leader or a commander or some minister or highly ranking official, in a low context communication way, then they might actually offend them. A very good example highlighted by the person quoted here on that slide is an Eastern Asian official goes to an official visit to the United States. As he arrives at the airport, the immigration officer starts asking a lot of questions about the purpose of the visit. While this is a very normal practice for a US immigration officers, it's very offensive to the Eastern Asian government representative. And what he decided at that point is that he decided to go back, and he didn't want to carry on with the visit to the United States because he thought he was being insulted. So these are just like few examples of how different communication styles, and then how the power distance values play into that, and what needs to be noted when you are from a small power distance working in a large power distance, or if you're from a large power distance and you're being addressed informally in a small power distance culture, you should not perceive that as some sort of insult. So we'll stop here for now, and the next video we will be talking about the collectivist individualist values, and also this will touch upon what we've spoken about previously in terms of power distance and communication methods.